The rain had come without warning, hammering the dry earth like the sky had something to say. Thunder rolled across the plains in long, low growls, the kind that made a man feel small. At the edge of a lonely patch of land, marked only by a twisted oak, a grave had just been filled. Samuel Grady stood beside it, soaked through his hat and long coat, his boots sunk in the mud. The shovel leaned against the tree like it, too, had lost the strength to go on. A small wooden cross, hand-carved and plain, marked the resting place. No name. He didn't need one. Everyone who mattered already knew who lay beneath. Beside him, his son, Ben, didn't cry. He hadn't cried since the fever took her 3 nights ago. He just stood still, skinny arms wrapped around the neck of a worn-out stuffed horse, eyes dull. 9 years old and already learning that the world didn't care how much it took from you. Samuel cleared his throat, tried to speak, and failed. The wind stole whatever words he had left. Back at the house, the silence stretched too wide, too loud. The chair she used to sit in by the fire looked like a ghost itself. Her apron still hung on the hook. The scent of her, lavender and horses, lingered like a memory refusing to fade. Ben pushed a wooden toy along the floor in slow, aimless circles. Samuel poured himself a drink, the first since she'd passed. His hand trembled when he raised the glass, not from the liquor, but from the weight of everything else. Out there in the world, the West kept moving. Railroads, cattle drives, new towns springing up like weeds. But here on the Grady Ranch, time had stopped. 100 miles away, Clara Mae Dalton adjusted her veil for the last time. Ivory lace stitched by hand, not a thread out of place. She'd always been the meticulous type, every plait set right, every promise believed in until proven otherwise. The little church outside Dry Creek smelled of lilies and old pine, and the pews groaned under the weight of the curious and the hopeful. But as the sun dipped behind the steeple and the preacher cleared his throat for the 5th time, there was no groom in sight. Whispers rose like smoke. One woman leaned over to another and muttered, "Heard he ran off with that saloon girl from Laramie. The one with the mole." Clara stood still, her eyes locked on the church doors as if she could will him through them. Her jaw didn't tremble. Her hands didn't shake. She just breathed. One step back, another. The lace train of her dress dragged through the dust. Then she turned and walked out of the church, down the steps, past the townsfolk with their pitying eyes and gossipy smirks. She made it to the edge of the road before she ripped the veil from her head and hurled it into a puddle. Her boots splashed through the mud as she stomped toward her buggy, teeth clenched tight. A man from the crowd called after her, "You all right, Clara?" She didn't answer, just climbed into the driver's seat, snapped the reins, and vanished in a spray of mud and broken dreams. By nightfall, Clara found herself on a road she didn't recognize. The rain hadn't let up. It poured through her bonnet, soaked through her corset, and plastered her curls to her cheeks. But she didn't stop, not until her mare started limping and the wheel on the buggy cracked. She spotted a flickering lantern ahead, an old roadside inn with peeling paint and a sign that read, "Sweet Water Stop, Meals, Beds, and Mercy for Travelers." Inside, the fire popped and hissed in protest of the wet logs tossed onto it. Clara entered like a ghost, soggy, silent, and ignored. The barkeep didn't look up from his papers until she dropped a small pouch of coins on the counter. "Room for one," she said, her voice hoarse. He eyed her a moment. "One bed left. Ain't much." Don't need much, she muttered, wringing out her dress. Behind her, the door creaked open again. Heavy bootsteps. A gust of cold air. Samuel Grady stepped inside, dusted in mud and rode. His hat was pulled low, but Clara recognized the kind, stoic, storm-scarred, and used to losing more than he gained. They didn't speak, not at first. Ben peeked around his father's leg, eyes wide at the sight of the soaked woman with fire in her posture and a pistol on her hip. Clara stared back at the boy. Something softened in her face. "You look like my mama," Ben said suddenly, his voice small. Clara flinched, not because of the words, but because of the honesty behind them. Samuel put a hand on the boy's shoulder and gave a tight nod. "Sorry, miss. He means no harm." "No harm done," she replied, brushing a wet strand of hair from her face. The innkeeper chuckled low. "Looks like you two got a storm chasing you both." Samuel glanced at Clara, then back at the fire. "Ain't the storm that's the problem. It's what's waiting after." Clara didn't respond, but she knew what he meant. The next morning, the sun rose reluctant and pale. Mud still lined the road. Clara sat on the porch steps of the inn, sipping bitter coffee and staring into the distance like it owed her something. Her mare was still lame, her dress was drying on a clothesline, and her future, well, that looked emptier than her hands. Samuel stepped outside, the boy trailing close behind. "You looking for work?" he asked, surprising them both. Clara looked up, skeptical. "Depends on the kind. Chores, cooking, helping a boy remember how to smile." She raised an eyebrow. "You hiring a nanny or a savior?" He didn't blink. "Neither. Just need someone who don't scare easy." She sipped her coffee again, slow. "I've stared down worse than grief, cowboy." "Good," he said. "Then come with us. Just till the road clears." She stood, stretched, and looked toward the road. 3 days, she said. "After that, I'm gone." Ben beamed. Samuel gave the faintest hint of a smile. As they rode off down the muddy road, the wind picked up again, whistling through the trees like a promise not yet fulfilled. Behind them, the innkeeper shook his head and muttered to himself, "A widower, a boy, and a bride with a broken heart. If that ain't the start of something, I don't know what is." And the West, never one to stay quiet for long, watched it all unfold. The Grady Ranch sat quiet beneath a cloudless sky, the kind that stretched so wide it made a person feel exposed. Clara stepped out of the wagon with dust in her teeth and skepticism in her bones. Her boots crunched over dry gravel as she scanned the land, stables, a weathered barn, and a modest house with a crooked porch swing that creaked like it had stories of its own. "Not what I pictured," she said flatly, wiping sweat from her brow. Samuel glanced at her, then led the mare toward the corral without answering. He didn't waste words, she'd noticed that already. Ben hopped down from the wagon, clutching a sack of marbles and trailing behind like a shadow with questions. Clara watched him move, careful and half-curious, like a colt testing a fence line. Inside the house, the air smelled of pine soap, dust, and something older, grief, maybe. The floors were clean, the furniture sparse, and everywhere she looked there were tiny echoes of a woman who no longer lived there, a faded shawl on a hook, a needlepoint still framed on the wall. In the kitchen, the stove looked too clean, like it hadn't been used in weeks. "Spare rooms out back," Samuel said, thumbing toward a small side addition. You'll find linens and a lamp. We rise before dawn. Charming, Clara muttered. What time's supper? He blinked. Whenever it's hot. Clara dropped her satchel onto the bed and stood in the narrow room, letting out a slow breath. The silence outside was almost oppressive, pressing against the window panes like it wanted in. She'd agreed to stay 3 days, but by the feel of it, 3 might already be too many. At dinner, the 3 of them sat at a lopsided table. Clara had cooked beef stew, thick and peppery, with biscuits hard enough to stop a bullet. She watched Samuel eat slowly, methodically, like chewing was more chore than pleasure. This house could use a woman's touch, she said between bites. Samuel didn't look up. Had one. Ben, mouthful, added, Mama made better biscuits. Clara raised an eyebrow. Well, maybe next time I'll make bricks and let you gnaw on those. Ben grinned, showing a missing tooth. You sound like Mama, too. When she was mad. The grin faded fast. His spoon clinked in the bowl. Samuel's fork paused midair. Clara said nothing. The next morning came with roosters and aching muscles. Clara wasn't new to labor, but ranch work was different, heavier, dirtier, quieter. Samuel showed her how to repair a fence post without words, just handed her a hammer and nodded at a splintered beam. She fell into the rhythm, smack, pull, brace, repeat. He watched from a few paces off, not correcting, not helping, just watching. Later, she scrubbed laundry while Ben splashed nearby with the enthusiasm only a child could afford. He brought her a crushed wildflower and placed it in her apron pocket without explanation. She didn't thank him, just let it sit there like a secret. Samuel came home that night with a split lip and blood on his knuckles. Cougar got into the henhouse, he said. Took 2 birds. Clara pressed a wet rag to his face. You punched the cougar. I missed. Her laughter cracked through the silence like thunder on a dry plain. Samuel didn't smile, but he didn't walk away either. Days passed. Chores found their rhythm. Mornings turned into routines, and evenings softened just enough that dinner didn't feel like a funeral. Clara rearranged the pantry, polished the windows, and found a box of old toys and gave them to Ben, who took to her like a stray pup to a warm porch. Still, tension hung between the adults like a taut rope. She caught Samuel staring sometimes, like he was remembering something painful or trying not to. One night, Clara found a bundle of letters tucked into a kitchen drawer. They were tied with blue ribbon and smelled faintly of lavender. She knew she shouldn't read them. She read them anyway. They were love letters, soft, sweet, simple, from a wife to her husband. The kind that made Clara's chest tighten and her eyes sting. She slid them back into the drawer before the grief could catch her, too. That evening, after Ben had gone to bed, Clara stood out by the fence, the stars spilling across the sky like spilled sugar. Samuel joined her without a word, arms folded, eyes squinting toward nothing. She was your compass, wasn't she? Clara said. He didn't answer. Clara crossed her arms. Me, I was engaged twice. First one died in the war. Second one ran off with a woman who dances better than she thinks. I can't seem to get past the altar without losing somebody. He looked at her for a long moment. Why'd you come here? I didn't, she said. The road just gave out. They stood like that for a while, shoulder to shoulder, saying nothing. The next day, Clara found Ben by the barn, tears streaking his dirt-covered cheeks. His wooden horse was broken, snapped clean through at the neck. "I dropped it," he said, clutching the pieces. "Mama gave it to me." Clara knelt beside him, wiping his face with her sleeve. "You still have her, right here." She touched his chest gently. "She's not here." "No," Clara said. "But I am." She didn't mean to say it. The words just came, and when they did, they settled into the space between them like they belonged there. That night, Samuel came home with 2 books, children's stories, well-worn but complete. Clara read aloud while Ben leaned against her shoulder, warm and quiet. When the boy fell asleep, she tucked the blanket tighter around him and rose to find Samuel waiting in the doorway. "You're good with him," he said. She shrugged. "He's easy. It's the tall ones that don't talk who are a problem." He smirked, the first honest one she'd seen. "You stayin' past the 3rd day?" he asked. She looked down the hall toward the room that no longer felt borrowed. "I might." That weekend, they rode into town together, Ben sandwiched between them on the wagon bench, holding Clara's hand like he'd always done so. The town bustled with market stalls and dusty laughter. Samuel bought nails and wire. Clara found cloth for curtains. Ben tried to trade his marbles for a cinnamon stick and managed to sweet-talk the vendor into giving it to him for free. On the way home, the wagon hit a rut, jostling everyone hard. Clara laughed, Samuel cursed under his breath, and Ben howled with delight. "Feels like we've been doing this forever," Clara said. Samuel's voice came quiet. "Maybe we should." The words hung there, not quite a question, not yet a promise. That night, after dinner, Clara was folding towels when Ben peeked around the corner and asked, "Can I call you Mama Clara?" She froze. Samuel was behind him, still as stone. Clara looked between them, her heart rising into her throat. "You can," she said softly. Ben grinned and bolted down the hall. Samuel lingered. "He's not forgetting her. You know that." "I'm not asking him to," she replied. He nodded. Then, after a pause, "He's not the only one learning how to breathe again." Clara turned away so he wouldn't see the tears she refused to let fall. That night, as she lay awake in a room that no longer felt like someone else's, she listened to the house breathe, floorboards creaking, wind whispering, the soft rise and fall of 2 lives adjusting to a 3rd. And somewhere in the distance, under that endless sky, the road didn't seem so broken after all. The morning sun hadn't even cleared the ridgeline when a shot cracked through the valley like God snapping his fingers. Birds scattered from the trees, and Ben dropped the pail of water he was hauling from the well. Clara burst through the front door, barefoot, hair still tied up in a sleep knot, rifle already in her hands. Samuel was ahead of her, moving fast but quiet, a long-barreled shotgun slung over one shoulder. They found the source not 20 paces from the barn. A rattler, thick as Clara's wrist, lay twitching in the dirt, its head a pulp of blood and fong. Smoke curled from the barrel of Ben's small rifle, an old sawed-down thing Samuel had given him for practice, not use. "I saw it first," Ben said, his voice trembling but proud. "Didn't wait to scream." Samuel knelt by the snake, examining the kill. "You hit center. That took nerve." Clara took the rifle from the boy's shaking hands, setting it aside. She knelt, too, brushing back his hair. That took more than nerve, sweetheart. That took instinct. Ben stood taller after that, even if he flinched when Clara tossed the snake into the fire pit later that evening. But the shot had done more than scare the birds. By the next morning, riders came down the slope. 2 of them, lean and mean-looking, with dust on their coats and eyes that didn't blink often enough. Samuel met them at the gate, hat low and hand resting just near his holster. "Morning," said the one with the scar running down his jaw. "Heard a gunshot yesterday. Figured it was just a snake or such." Samuel's eyes didn't move from theirs. "It was. My boy handled it." "Boy, huh?" the second man said, spit hitting the dust. "Good shooting for someone that small." "Real good," the other agreed, smiling slow. "Maybe too good." Clara stood on the porch, arms crossed, the rifle leaning by the door. Her presence wasn't subtle. "State your business," Samuel said. The men shared a glance. "We're just passing through. Looking for someone. Stole a horse from a ranch up near Tall Pine. Chestnut mare, scar over her eye." "We don't steal," Samuel replied. "Wasn't accusing," the scarred one said, turning his horse. "Just noticing. Funny how quiet some places stay, until they ain't." They left with dust in their wake and a promise unspoken but not unnoticed. That night, Clara locked every window twice. Samuel cleaned his guns. Ben slept with the wooden horse under his arm again. 2 days later, the barn was set ablaze. It happened fast, like fire always does. Clara awoke to the smell of smoke, and by the time Samuel had his boots on, the sky above the stables was orange. He ran without a word. Clara grabbed buckets and roused Ben. The flames devoured the roof in seconds. Samuel burst through the doors, leading 2 horses out by their reins, coughing, eyes red from the smoke. Clara took the pails, throwing water while Ben scrambled to fetch more. They formed a frantic rhythm, yelling over the roar until the fire finally surrendered to their grit. By dawn, the barn was nothing but a smoldering rib cage of blackened wood. "Someone did this," Clara said flatly, breathing hard. Samuel didn't answer. His jaw worked silently, his hands trembled just a little when he reached for his canteen. Ben sat on a barrel nearby, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the ashes with a hollow look in his eyes. That afternoon, Clara rode into Dry Creek. She didn't wear a dress this time. She wore trousers, boots, and a scowl that could freeze whiskey. She walked straight into the sheriff's office and slapped a coin purse onto his desk. "I want names," she said. Sheriff Danvers leaned back in his chair, scratching the bald patch beneath his hat. "Names cost more than that, Clara." They lit a match on a family, she snapped. "If you ain't going to help, then stay out of my way when I find them." The sheriff gave a long sigh. "Rumor is the Mallister boys been roamin' that valley since their daddy's land was taken for rail. Bitter as old coffee and twice as mean." "What's their problem with Sam?" "Samuel Grady used to ride with their father, years ago. Some cattle war. There's old blood there, and old blood stains deep." Clara left without another word. On the way out of town, she bought a second pistol and more rounds than she'd need. By the time she returned, Samuel was reinforcing the house windows with planks. "You knew it might be them," she said. "I did," he replied. "You should have told me." He met her eyes. You're not part of this. I am now. They stood silent for a breath. I'm not just the woman in your kitchen, Samuel, Clara said. I've lost too much to watch this place burn while you keep secrets. He looked at her then, really looked, like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't a temporary fixture anymore. All right, he said. Then we fight smart. That night, Ben fell asleep on the floor in front of the fire while Samuel laid out a rifle, a shotgun, and 2 pistols on the table. Clara cleaned each one with the care of someone who knew that a weapon was only as good as the hands behind it. They'll come back, she said. Samuel nodded. And we'll be ready. The days that followed were tense, quiet. They worked together like clock gears, tight, precise, unspoken understanding passing between them. Samuel taught Clara how to shoot from cover, she taught him how to listen for footfalls in dry grass. Ben practiced with a slingshot and traps, eager to help, too young to understand that war had already come to his doorstep. Then, on the 4th night, the Mallister boys returned. 4 of them this time, with lanterns and hand pistols at their hips. They came slow, casual, like they were riding into a bar fight they'd already won. Clara spotted them first from the loft window. They brought friends, she muttered, loading the rifle. Samuel stepped beside her, checking his shotgun. I'll take the flank, Clara said. You keep their eyes. He nodded. Don't get shot. She grinned, sharp and fast. You too, sweetheart. When the first shot rang out, it echoed across the hills. Gunfire followed, rapid and sharp, flashing in the dark like the sky had lit a second fire. Clara moved through shadow and brush, her boots silent on the dirt, firing clean and low. Samuel took cover behind the front porch, each shot deliberate, purposeful. Ben stayed inside, just as they told him, curled under the kitchen table with a blanket and the wooden horse, whispering prayers only the desperate understand. The fight didn't last long. It never does, really, not when the people defending have something to lose and the ones attacking only have their bitterness. 2 Mallister boys were dead before the others fled. One limped, dragging a bleeding leg, the other fired wildly behind him, then vanished into the trees. When the dust settled, Clara stood over the porch, panting, eyes wild, blood smeared across her cheek, not hers. Samuel lowered his shotgun and walked toward her. You all right? He asked. She nodded. You? He looked at the bodies on the ground, then at the boy peeking through the window, then back at Clara. I am now. She dropped her rifle and leaned against the porch post, exhaling like she'd been holding her breath since before she arrived on this land. In the days that followed, the sheriff came and went, muttering about self-defense and territorial law. No charges were brought, no apologies made. But something had shifted. The ghosts that haunted the ranch hadn't vanished, but they'd been faced down. And sometimes, that's all you can ask. Ben started calling her Mama without the Clara part. And Samuel, one night over coffee and silence, reached across the table and took her hand. He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't have to. The days had settled into an uneasy peace at the Grady Ranch, the kind of stillness that could either be the calm before another storm or the reluctant acceptance of something too worn to fight anymore. Clara woke up earlier each morning, a new habit she hadn't meant to form. The sun stretched across the land, and she would stand on the porch, feeling the cold air chase away the remnants of night, breathing in deep like she was trying to let something into her that wasn't just dust. Samuel had said less in the past few days. He worked with a quiet intensity that Clara had learned to read by now. His focus was razor sharp, but his eyes always seemed to be looking just beyond the horizon, as if waiting for something to break the silence, waiting for a future that hadn't yet arrived. Ben was growing too fast. Clara could feel it. He was taller now, his clothes tighter, his hands rougher from the hours he spent outside helping Samuel rebuild what had been lost. His laugh, too, had changed, deeper, more like a man than a child, even though he still grinned like the same kid who had once handed her a crushed wildflower. But the change she couldn't ignore was in herself. It wasn't love, not yet, she hadn't admitted that to herself, but it was something close to it. There was a tenderness between her and Samuel now, an understanding forged in the kind of hardship that made everything clearer. He wasn't just the widowed rancher anymore, and she wasn't just the woman who'd arrived as a stranger. She was something different, something stronger, and she was rooted here, whether she liked it or not. One evening, as twilight turned the sky a dark violet, Samuel stood at the edge of the field, a long shadow beneath the looming mountains. Clara stood with her hands on her hips, watching him, waiting for something she wasn't sure what. But she felt it in the way the air hung between them, like they were both holding their breath for the words that neither of them had said yet. She walked toward him, boots silent on the soft earth. "The wind's picking up," she said, her voice carrying a weight it hadn't had before. "A storm's coming." Samuel's eyes, always so guarded, flicked toward her. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just the land settling into a new way of being." He paused, then added, almost to himself, "You ever think about that? How things can change even when they're still the same?" Clara didn't respond right away. She leaned against a nearby fence post, letting the wind lift her hair, letting the moment stretch out. "Every day," she said finally. "I think about it all the time." He took a step closer, and for the first time, there was nothing in his eyes but the kind of silence that invited something more. "You don't have to stay, Clara. I never expected you to." Her pulse quickened. "I'm not going anywhere." He nodded as though the words had been spoken into a gap that had been there longer than either of them had acknowledged. Then, without another word, Samuel reached out and pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her like it was the simplest thing in the world, like he'd always known she'd be there. Clara's heart stuttered, not from fear but from something that felt like relief. She breathed him in, the scent of leather, smoke, and the sweat of a man who had borne more pain than he deserved. And it was in that moment, wrapped in his arms, that Clara realized she had already made a home in the place she'd thought would never be hers. The storm came the next night, fierce and unrelenting. Rain battered the windows like the sky was trying to tear the world apart. Lightning split the air, and the thunder shook the ground. Samuel and Clara huddled close to the fire, Ben curled up in a chair by the hearth with a book, trying to read despite the storm's violence. Then came a knock. Clara's heart leaped. She shot a glance at Samuel, whose jaw tightened. "I'll get it," she said, standing quickly. It wasn't until she opened the door that the cold hit her full force, and with it, the unmistakable shape of two riders on horseback, their silhouettes blurred by the rain. One of them was covered in mud and blood, clutching his arm like it had been broken, his face pale and wild with panic. "We need shelter," the man gasped. "Malisters coming for us." Clara didn't hesitate. She stepped aside to let them in, her heart already thumping with dread. Samuel followed, eyes narrowing at the newcomers. "Malisters?" he asked, his voice low and steady. The man, tall with a gaunt face, nodded. They found us. Took everything we had and burned the rest. We barely made it. The second rider, his face hidden beneath a hood, didn't speak. He just staggered into the kitchen, blood dripping from his side. Ben stood up from his chair, wide-eyed, but Clara motioned for him to stay back. We can't stay here, the first man continued, his voice cracking. They'll come for us next. Clara moved swiftly, grabbing bandages and a needle, while Samuel stepped into the other room. He grabbed his rifle, checked it with the precision of a man who had learned the hard way that survival wasn't about hesitation. Malisters won't stop, Samuel muttered, more to himself than anyone else. We thought we'd seen the last of them. Clara shot him a glance. And now? Now, he said, we stopped them. The hours that followed were a blur of preparation. Samuel and Clara worked in tandem, their movements fluid, each anticipating the other's needs without a word spoken. They secured the windows, checked the ammunition, and made sure Ben was out of sight, safe in the loft. The riders, the wounded ones, had been offered a bed by the fire, but they'd only taken a moment to rest before the inevitable reality settled in. They were too far from help, and there was no escaping the Malisters. The fight was coming to them. And when the first Malister came over the ridge, riding like he owned the earth beneath him, they were ready. Clara barely had time to think. It was like a switch had flipped. She was no longer just the woman who had stumbled into their lives. She was someone else now, someone who had learned what it meant to protect something that mattered. Samuel had the first shot. He didn't miss. The Malisters didn't retreat, they charged. It was a blur of gunfire, thunder, and shouting. Clara's hands were steady, but her heart thundered in her chest. Samuel was a force of nature, as precise as he was brutal. He didn't waste a single bullet. But there were too many of them. A third man arrived, then a fourth, and they were closing in faster than expected. Samuel fired again, hitting the second man dead center, but his arm was grazed in the process, and he staggered back. Clara rushed forward, pulling him behind a stack of barrels, the storm still howling around them. We have to move, she shouted, her voice barely heard over the rain and the chaos. I'm not leaving, Samuel said, his breath ragged. He pushed himself to his knees, grabbing his rifle again, but Clara wouldn't let him go. You are. And I'm coming with you. They fought their way out of the barn, moving with the speed of desperation. They had no choice but to run, to fight with everything they had until they couldn't anymore. The Malisters pursued them through the trees, their shouts getting louder, closer. And then, in a final surge, Clara turned, rifle in hand, and fired once more, taking the Malister leader down. He fell, clutching his chest, and the others froze, eyes wide with shock. It was over. The Malisters turned and fled, leaving behind their dead, their pride shattered. Samuel collapsed beside her, breathing heavily as Clara crouched next to him, her hands shaking but her resolve unbroken. It's done, she said, her voice soft but certain. He looked at her then, his face smeared with blood and rain. I didn't think we'd make it. Clara placed a hand on his arm. But we did. We're still here. And when they finally made their way back to the house, the storm having finally passed, they didn't need to say anything else. There was no more doubt, no more hesitation. This was their home, the space they had fought for. Clara took Samuel's hand, feeling the strength of it, the weight of everything that had brought them here. And for the first time in a long while, she felt whole. Home, after all, was where the hurt healed. And the hurt had been their salvation.